Welcome, dear viewers, for another installment of Twilight Abridged. This chapter begins with a brief allusion to Edward's taste in music, then moves on to how he was turned. Being born in 1901, he's old enough to be Bella's great-grandfather. But because he contracted the Spanish flu in 1918 and was turned by Carlisle, who was apparently lonely, he was stuck in the body of a 17-year-old. Coincidentally, Esme, who had fallen from a cliff, was taken directly to the morgue of the same exact hospital while her heart was still beating, even though even Boy Scouts were being taught CPR by 1911, and paramedics would be the first to know that her heart was actually still beating and wouldn't have taken her to the morgue. Good job, Meyer. Meyer also wants you to think that Carlisle was oh so nice as to save people whose only other choice was death. However, he was taking the choice from them. After all, it's still a choice, and he's making it for them without letting them decide for themselves. That's not very nice. Anyway, Rosalie was turned in order to be a love interest for Edward that didn't work out, which serves as an oh-so-vague allusion to the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, which Meyer constantly cites as one of the many classical bases for this travesty here. For those of you who don't know, Romeo had a prior love interest before Juliet named Rosaline. Note the lack of creativity on the part of Meyer in naming her prior love interest figure. Yeah. Like Romeo to Juliet, Edward's attraction for Bella is shallow, being based on only her smell. Unlike Bella and Edward, though, Romeo and Juliet's attraction was blatantly portrayed as being the stupidity of youth. Moving on. Rosalie found Emmett while she was hunting, and he was being attacked by a bear. Although Meyer has stated so far that when they're hunting, her fairies will attack anything in their hunting area that appeals to them, and humans are the most tasty of all the things out there. Instead of feeding on him, Rosalie carries Emmett over 100 miles to Carlisle to have him save Emmett, instead of taking him to a hospital, because that would be too smart. Alice and Jasper were apparently developed a conscience before they joined the Cullens, which would be the phrase Meyer would use to call what happens when her fairies decide not to feed on humans. They were apparently destined for each other, making them another basis for Meyer's warped concept of love, as they supposedly sought each other out before even being aware of one another. And Alice can see the future and presence of other fairies. Whoop-de-doo. Then Edward and Bella go inside her house, Edward opening the door for her, having known where a hidden key was, even though she'd never used it when he was around, that she was aware of, and that he had been spying on her was somehow flattering to her, instead of creeping her the fuck out like it would a sane person. He also informed her that he had been watching her sleep almost every night since however long back, without her knowing about it, and all she was fucking concerned about was what she'd said in her sleep. Genius. Then her dad came home. She dodged conversation as best she could, then rushed up to her room, going to her window to invite Edward in, but as it turns out, the creepy fairy was already on her bed. Then she took a shower, leaving him alone in her room, and then came back, and as an aside, if you're reading along, you'll notice that even now she keeps her toothpaste and toothbrush in a bag in her room instead of leaving it in the bathroom like someone did if they actually considered where they're living at their home, which means she already has no intention of staying for any length of time. Then they have a bit of alone time, meant to get the hormones pumping from the audience. And as it turns out, Edward merely has to will himself to not be overcome by his hunger, which means that he has no internal conflict anymore. Or at least not until the next time he angst about being oh so dangerous. And even though Mike had been nothing but nice to Bella, Edward tells you that Mike's vile. Edward hides when Charlie checks in on Bella and she pretends to sleep, and then they have more alone time, continuing to be obsessed with only one another, and she has him tell her why he'd bothered denying his own nature, and he tries to claim it as being some sort of sense of morality that, as they aren't human, as so many fans would claim when trying to argue against the need for him to have any working character flaw, should have no actual bearing on them. If you could follow that, good on you. Then she asks him about his and the others' powers, although he, Alice, and Jasper are the only ones with anything that isn't simply a character trait to be called a power by Meyer. Then she asks where the source of their fairydom stems from, but Meyer dances around the issue. Then there's more small talk, and she already begins inquiring about the possibilities of them having sex. So much for this series promoting abstinence. And then she falls asleep with his cold arms around her, despite having constantly complained about how much she doesn't like cold and prefers warmth. Thank you for joining me for another installment of Twilight Abridged, brought to you by the good people at TwilightSucks.com. Twilight sucks because we have only 10 chapters left, being well over halfway through, and still have yet to be introduced to any sort of real conflict.